Okay, so first I will give you the vote. まだ始めない方がいいか。今始まった。Okay. Yep, so how I will structure this OA, I will give you the vote and then the justification, and I'm told that I need to give like a speaker score explanation. So that I will do as well. So we had a very constructive discussion, but I reached this decision, which is that in first we have opening government, and in second we have closing government, and third in opening opposition, and fourth, unfortunately, to closing opposition. I will note that the margin between OO and CO is pretty small, so I'm very willing and happy to answer questions regarding this comparison. Okay, now let's just dive right into the OA. So opening government had a couple of things, but largely two very important things. The first is about how we ought to respect people's choice. And this was not just, it was presented as a principal claim from Prime Minister, but it wasn't just a principal claim. There were also a lot of aspects about how practically we ought to respect people's choices, because in certain instances, it's more preferable, like practically speaking, for people to die as opposed to live. And the second large push from opening government is that even if people, even if people choose to die on like gov side and also on op side, why probably living in gov world is a preferable choice for these people. Okay. And also, yeah, thirdly, I will note that there is material from mainly from Deputy about how people are going to be informed about death, and the narrative surrounding death in the government world, and how that also interacts with the choice argument and the choice clash that happens within the opening half. Opening opposition largely has two things. The first and probably the biggest point is about how more pressurization happens. And this is mainly two mechanisms. The first is that there is high pressure exerted on these individuals who are likely to be considering euthanasia because of like high cost of, for example, medical treatment, or being your family's thinking that you are a burden in certain instances, like inheritance, all of that, like infighting, etc. But there is also some another mechanism is about how people are likely to be weak and irrational, etc. when considering these things. This is also present in, for example, the DLO's POI response to DPM, for example. And also, if you look carefully, for opening option also has some societal impacts about how medical care, how the resources allocated to euthanasia ought to be, in fact, allocated to medical care, which allows people to live longer lives. So, how did I compare opening government and opening opposition? Two things. The first is about peer pressure. Was it more likely to happen on Gov? Is it exclusive? Or even if it did happen on both sides, which is the more preferable scenario? So opening opposition, I think I've already explained how opening opposition has mainly set up their point about peer pressure, but opening government already at the big point, Prime Minister has a couple of responses. It's the fact that the first thing they say is that it's probably largely symmetric. And it's not just like a very lazy response saying, "Oh, it's just symmetric." They opening Prime Minister explains how surrounding people, or like for example, already express frustration against disabled people and elderly people in the status quo. They talk about pressurization happens anyway, etc. But beyond that, there is more like material coming from opening government. The fact that people in general want to live more, because you have a lot of reasons. You have nostalgia, you have your fear of death, you have optimism bias, all of these things. But the fact that you are already considering death probably means that you are pushed to a certain extent of unhappiness. You are pushed, over a certain high hurdle where you finally start considering death, regardless of all of the forces within society and all of the forces within your psyche, your biology, etc., that pushes you to live and overcome all of that and choose to die. This and also there is this material also from opening government about how people who choose suicide will still do so regardless of like going through this thought process. So the fact that the harm of continuing to live can only be perceived by this person, which means that probably other people have an obligation to respect this choice because they have no idea about what this person is experiencing. And they also talk about state obligation to respect this choice and also to allow accessibility towards this choice. And as another layer to this response to opening opposition, opening government says that even if pressurization happened on both sides of the house, opening government material is still largely above opening opposition, because opening opposition is able to prove mainly two things. The first is that probably euthanasia is a better way to die compared to just suicide, because this is the material prime minister, which is about suicide, has generally a high risk of failure. And the process of suicide itself is very painful. And the fact that the comparative is euthanasia being a much more painless process. And yeah, I'm not saying that suicide is the counterfactual of opening opposition, because opening opposition also talks about passive euthanasia, but I will touch on that later on. The second thing about this even if response is that opening government talks about how there is more more information when it comes to this discourse and narrative and surrounding death. The fact that there are more, for example, statistics available because the state is responsible of, taking control of this policy. Maybe the state itself might not be, conducting the euthanasia itself. We don't know what this world is going to look like, but probably the state is going to have some level of oversight, and it's not like largely challenged. So I think this is a fair claim. But also, I think open government does lay out in the setup about how, in the comparative, people start to, consider, even if people consider euthanasia, there is likely to be some sort of counseling process on the way, which means that it's not like you one day think that you want to die and then you'll be like dead like the next day, but there's probably going to be some sort of like time lapse, some sort of time where you get to consult other people, etc. Okay, so I think that, but even if you disregard this, I think that the fact that this is pointed out by closing government, but the fact that opening opposition is fine with passive euthanasia, this is not like a critical. It's not like it's not like detrimental concession to opening opposition. But I think we still do have to recognize that this mitigates a lot of opening opposition impacts as well. So I think that, well, this applies in the CGOO comparison as well. But probably this concession means that the delta that opening opposition is still able to claim is necessarily smaller. And the second thing to note within OGO comparison is that I think OG has a lot of material when it comes to, the weighing between choice to die and prohibiting the choice to die. Opening government talks about how people, for example, should not intervene because people cannot perceive what is good for someone, because that person who is considering death is the only person that is able to experience what this person is undergoing, and the only person, in fact, responsible for this. But also the fact that opening government does say that, at least on their side of the house, this sort of subjective happiness or subjective fulfillment is likely to be experienced. So I think that in terms of peer pressure, number one, I think opening government provides sufficient response here. But secondly, when it comes to weighing, I think opening government is still able to prove that at a sort of like principle like level that we should probably prioritize the right to die. Okay. So let's bring in closing government into this debate. Closing government has a very interesting extension, which probably roughly can be summarized around the word antinatalism. They say a couple of things. First, they talk about why life is bad. People live in depression, poverty, and hierarchical oppression, etc. People, compared to others, they are inherently unhappy, biologically programmed to experience suffering. Never-ending global warming was one of the points. Second thing they say is people should not be brought to life because you cannot be choose to born. Child is not informed, but parents are, and this is terrible. And they also talk about how people should stop procreating, or the harms of procreating is very terrible because of many reasons why people somehow tend to procreate. Okay. So how does this interact with OG? I think that what this also appeared in the discussion, but how we saw, or how I saw this contribution from closing government, is that probably inherently closing government's contribution is that it really extends the impact and brings the delta between government bench and opposition bench further, because it's fair to say that this huge extensive problem analysis provided by closing government means that the more this problem is larger, probably the impact of solving it is probably also going to be larger. But nevertheless, I thought that opening government should still come above closing government for mainly two reasons. The first is that OG is the bench that proves why GovBench as a whole is able to, in fact, reach that impact of people having a better choice when it comes to choosing life. This is because OG explains the process with which people are able to choose their life. But the second thing is that antinatalism might apply in some contexts, and probably it might even apply in the majority of contexts if we buy closing government's extensive characterization. But this debate also operates in other contexts where people might want to live, or people might want to live. So I think that I do agree that taking more burdens per se is not necessarily valuable. Taking burdens per se is not necessarily a reason to vote opening government over closing government. But I think it is worth noting that opening government is in this sense like more charitable to the opposition bench when it comes to two or more scenarios existing within a round. And then closing government talks about glorification of life and being brainwashed is terrible. But this impact, I'm not sure why this is important to a certain extent, because if this glorification of life existed and if people are brainwashed, then my intuition is that why don't you then continue to live? So I think value judgment wise, I'm not sure how this impacting contributed, and so to speak, not necessarily contributing to CG overcoming opening government. Okay, so OO and CG, mainly three things. First, I think engagement that comes out of member about how passive euthanasia is also going to be means that you have a massive concession towards government bench is a very, very critical but also very obvious response. Secondly, I think CG is better able to deals with opening opposition's premise that living in and of itself is good. Of course, I'm not saying that OO's case was completely contingent on this, but opening opposition's main context is a context in which people might want to continue living, but are prohibited or prevented from doing so. And this is the context that closing government is uniquely able to narrow down when they say that life itself is not necessarily valuable. And finally, in terms of impacting, I think that closing government had much more material, illustration, etc., that should be credited within this round. Okay, bringing in closing opposition. Closing opposition has largely one large premise, and a couple of impacts sort of stemming from that. The biggest sort of premise here is that they claim that they will fulfill the burden of unconditional and universal accessibility of euthanasia, which means that when death becomes very accessible, and when the sort of like barrier to entry of death is lower, it means that the dignity of, for example, life, it decreases. It also means that death in and of itself is less sensational. Death in and of itself is less stigmatized, meaning that all of these things, these narratives surrounding life and death, becomes very, very normalized and very, very trivial. And the impact here that stems from here is that, number one, people are less likely to consider the risks, etc., of dying, but also about this is also stressed in the opposition whip about how there's more information to these people. Okay, so the one of the large, so one of the biggest problems that the panel and also I had with this is that we were not necessarily clear why this dignity impact, what this dignity is likely to look like, because obviously we need to know how people are going to perceive this dignity, and then how people are going to act upon that perception. But also I think this is probably at best like a possibility analysis. So yes, some people might value that death is more dignified in opposition world, but it's not necessarily clear why that's the likely scenario. So plausibility as opposed to a possibility. I think we needed more explanation there, which means that even if I am able to credit this mechanism, the extent of the impact in which this happens was not necessarily clear at the end of this debate. So how does this compare with opening opposition? Opening opposition at least provides some possible scenario and does provide very plausible impacting about these scenarios. Maybe it's fair that O was not being like as structural, or maybe like did not provide as much likelihood analysis as, for example, compared to opening government. But I think that OO should still be credited in the regard that they do provide some sort of plausible scenario, provides various illustrations, etc. Which in my view meant that OO's case seemed more realistic. OO was able to add a lot of reality to the claim, but also in terms of the extent to which the impacts exist, again, I was not able to see why this increase in dignity leads to to which extent the impact will increase in closing opposition side. however, see that opening opposition is able to claim some degree of solid impacts in certain contexts, even if they were not the most likely contexts. Okay. And the final thing is that I think GovBench points about being self-mitigatory, but this is not, my view is that this should not be a reason to differentiate between OO and CO. This probably equally mitigates both OO and CO's impact, so it's not necessarily clear. So this is not something that I put into consideration in the vertical comparison for opposition bench. Okay, so we have two more comparisons. So OG-CO. So on the discussion surrounding suicide, CO does provide engagement towards opening government about how more discussion happens when life is dignified and when death is regarded as sensational or stigmatized. But I think, and closing opposition impacts this by saying that more people are likely to die. There's, for example, less investigation when it comes to bullying, etc. But I think that this at best is probably equalizes opening government and especially DPM's analysis about how people are more likely to be informed in their world. So an opening government does provide what this discussion is likely to look like, what sort of information people are likely to have access to. So I think the reality of the scenario and it is in opening government side was higher, but also even if you disregard that, I think opening government still is able to claim the impact about how we ought to prioritize the necessity of people who want to die but are prevented from this. Okay. Finally, CG and CO. So CO responds to CG's anti-natalism claim by saying that this is irrelevant because this motion is about lives that already came into existence, as opposed to stopping lives from coming into existence before they come into existence. But I think that I do understand this question that arises out of closing opposition, but this does not necessarily sort of engage with the core of closing government's case, which is that living in and of itself is bad, and people need sort of like an exit from living. And so I think that probably in this sense, closing government's impact is probably relevant in this debate, insofar as closing government is able to provide and explain that getting out of life is probably an important thing. Yeah. And also closing government from GovWhip talks about, why the dignity of life is necessarily important in this debate. And I think that this question is probably fair when you consider what the constructive material that came out of closing opposition was like, and compare that with the member of government analysis, which is much more, I think I've already covered this, but multi-layered, providing lots of illustrations, adding reality to the scenario. I think that in this regard, probably closing government's scenario deserve a bit more credit in terms of the constructive material. Yeah, so that's my OA. We will proceed with the speaker score justification before we go to questions, because I think speaker scores thing deserves more priority. Okay. Okay. So sorry. So okay. Yeah, I'll talk about Deputy Prime Minister. So we gave not we I gave 80 to Deputy Prime Minister. I think some people might give 81, etc. But yeah, well, I settled with 80. So let's see what the 79-82 bracket looks like. It's that there are mainly three criteria. First is that arguments are relevant and addresses the core issues in this debate. I think lots of DPM material about how peer pressure is less likely to happen and how people are more likely to be informed in government world is probably very relevant in this debate and probably does address the core issues within this debate. The second thing is that arguments are well made without obvious logical gaps and are all well explained. I think this was definitely the case. And I think a lot of DPM's material did remain until the end of this debate and did contribute to opening government's win by taking down, for example, a lot of opening opposition's material about peer pressure, etc. Okay. And the final thing is that it may be vulnerable to good responses. Well, I think it's not necessarily vulnerable to like normal responses. Probably it requires a lot of to some degree a lot of legwork to take down, for example, the point about narrative. But yeah, maybe there was some room for responses if, for example, closing opposition had developed their idea on, how people would perceive death, etc. But I don't think that it is the case that it would be easy to take down this analysis. Yeah, so that's largely my what I thought would be fair scoring for this round. Yeah.